Trump is clearly exploring a radically different relationship between the U.S. and China. And because it's so radically different, and also, first because most people don't take Trump seriously. I like Peter Thiel's line. Don't take him literally, but do take him seriously.
Great line. In the United States, especially in Washington among the chattering political class, 2025 has been a year of considerable uncertainty, remarkable change, with some reversals, and for better or worse, no small amount of chaos for politics, government, and business. It's horrified institutionalists, it's thrilled disruptors. As American political junkies, which is what most of the audience of Across the Aisle is, we tend to focus on domestic elections. Yet it's international developments, opportunities seized and missed, that dictate a lot of our domestic situation. For many of us, even more for our fellow citizens around the globe, international actions determine war and peace, prosperity and suffering, even life and death. Even as political junkies, we find ourselves looking beyond our borders right now, watching the teetering governments of Canada, the United Kingdom and France, the emergence of far-right parties in Europe and Latin America, and the fall of democratic governments in Africa. As 2025 comes to an end and 2026 appears, however dimly in our crystal balls, we're fortunate to gain insight on, to borrow Lincoln's phrase, where we are and whither we're tending internationally from one of the true experts. Dr. Graham Allison, Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University, longtime Dean of the Kennedy School of Government here, where he's graciously hosting our session today, President Clinton's Assistant Secretary of Defense. Graham was the author of the seminal work on presidential decision-making during a crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essence of a Decision. Graham, how is it possible you published that 54 years ago? I assume it was a junior high school essay for you. He's most recently authored and briefed the heads of state of the United States and China, among others, on his study of rising powers destined for war. He's been my respected mentor and loyal friend for nearly 4 decades, and generously agreed to join us in Across the Aisle. Graham, as we tape this, and things are moving at a fast pace, so what we say today will be current only to this moment. Earlier today, President Trump announced a blockade of sanctioned vessels into and out of Venezuela. That blockade, which Kennedy very definitively called a quarantine, to avoid the word blockade that Trump is using, was a key part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me ask about Venezuela. I think Americans are wondering, are we about to go to war in Latin America? And if Venezuela has earned itself a war, it's not the only country to create problems with drugs. Where do you see us headed?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to engage with you in the conversation. You and I have been friends, as you say, for I think at least 4 decades, and I suspect that I say to my students in my course here at Harvard now, if you're not confused, you haven't been watching. And if you haven't been surprised in the past year, you're a liar. Okay? the number of things that have happened, if we just think about 2025, that at the beginning of if we were doing this time last year, that would surprise you. Some of which you would have been.
I'm glad we wouldn't look as smart as we are.
We wouldn't, and I think the notion of crystal balls is a good one, especially cloudy. So I think one of the big learnings and takeaways from 2025 for people that are serious is that the world is much less predictable than most experts or authorities would lead you to believe as they pontificate about them, including them. So it's not enough to simply say, well, we're all confused, trying to make as much sense of it as we can, but at the same time realizing and trying to calculate the pieces as we go forward is complicated. So 2 or 3 points. First, you rightly underline that President Trump has advertised this as a embargo, and President Kennedy, in the thing closest to this that we've at least seen in the American scene in 1962 with Cuba, was very precise about the proposition that this was, quote, not a blockade, this was a quarantine. Now, this is not simply a legal matter, though it is a legal matter. In international law, blockade is defined as or identified as an act of war. In Kennedy's case, he was very clear we were trying to avoid a war with the Soviet Union, which had been secretly placing nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. Kennedy was determined that this was not going to stand, that the missiles would have to be withdrawn, but not at the price of a war with the Soviet Union, which would have ultimately included nuclear bombs landing in Washington or Boston or otherwise. So he was about crafting a strategy for achieving our objectives without war. In this case, I think if I had been advising President Trump, I would have said a quarantine would have been a much more plausible proposition and much more likely to get international support. Now, where's it going to go from here? Who knows? As I say, I can write the scenario in which President Trump has pretty much signaled he's determined that Maduro is going to have to go. And if it has, he's able to strangle Venezuela economically with something like the current blockade. In time, the rest of the people around Maduro probably will conclude it's time for him to go, and maybe he'll even conclude that. Maybe they'll provide him some golden parachute of some sort. I suspect Trump wouldn't mind that. So I can think, in fact, if I were betting, I'd bet that by this time next year, Maduro is not there. Okay. But I can also see how this stumbles into first a confrontation on the quarantine line or the blockade line, and then to strikes on the mainland, and then what's to prevent Maduro and Venezuelans from taking some actions here in the U.S. I mean, we're a society that's pretty open, quite vulnerable to terrorist activities. So you could see it going another way. I think Trump is very clear he does not want to have a ground war, doesn't want to send Americans to be fighting there, but by the combination of naval power, which we have overwhelmingly, and air power. He's got the means, if he's prepared to do it, to essentially strangle Maduro and the Venezuelan government. Now, again, internationally, how does this make the U.S. appear? Well, if I remember, the last time someone invaded another country in order to steal its oil was Saddam Hussein and Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush organized the coalition that basically kicked Saddam out of Kuwait. That's an interesting example. But Putin's current activity in Ukraine could at least appear to some people to be not unlike Trump's behavior towards Venezuela. So that means we're moving back and closer and closer to jungle world.
A process question. Congress does not seem to be involved in this decision-making of what we do in Venezuela. And you will know expertly, I'm not sure they were terribly involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis decision-making. Not sure how much Congress was involved in Kuwait. Are we seeing issues like this becoming ever more the purview of the White House, not the Congress?
So in a word, yes. So this is a long story which you're familiar with. But basically, Congress has been, I will start with the Constitution. People who wrote the Constitution could not have been clearer. There were three competing branches of government, each with their own independent constituency. And their belief was that by their being independent parties, they would check and balance each other in a way that would preclude tyranny, which they saw as the king they were getting away from, who would unilaterally determine things.
Sure.
So they couldn't be clearer that only one party had the power to declare war. The Constitution doesn't make no ambiguity about that. It's Congress. But right from the beginning, presidents have started eroding that. Even Jefferson with the Barbary Pirates. And as time has gone on, Congress, I think, has been, which more to blame, the Congress or presidents? It's hard to, or most individuals who are president and have worked their way to becoming president believe they know what should be done. And the fact that they would like to expand their power, if you ask Franklin Roosevelt, he was as eager about expanding executive authority as Trump is, I think. But what prohibited that was a Congress that would, and a courts that would stand up and say, wait a minute, the way this game was set up and with our authorities, we're not required to roll over every time you say so. So over time, especially with respect to war, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and if you turn out to be wrong, you can be blamed. Members of Congress have more and more been prepared to whine and to sit on the sidelines and to criticize, but to avoid taking any responsibility. So they've not insisted on a...
Be careful what you ask for.
Exactly, and that became very clear when George W. Bush wanting to, initially, when George H.W. Bush was organizing a coalition to evict Saddam from Kuwait, they had a sense of the Senate resolution, and some senators, including Senator Sam Nunn, if I remember, a Democrat from Georgia who would have otherwise was on a path to being a plausible presidential candidate, voted wrong, thinking that it wasn't timely and that we didn't have the authority to do that. Bush had the act succeeded, and so if you were on the wrong side of things, you can be blamed. So Congress can have its cake and eat it by simply not taking actions and blaming the president for not allowing it to take actions, and then, depending on what happens, blaming him for it not working out.
President Trump made news, as he does daily, if not hourly, earlier this week, announcing his proposed visit to China next year and Premier's visit here the following year. Graham, are we seeing China being repositioned as an economic and business partner more than a global military threat? Is the ground shifting on China?
Well, you have a good eye, and you've been watching carefully. Most people haven't. I think the answer is maybe, okay, possibly, quite possibly. So This is a topic I study every day and have written about. It's hard to talk about briefly, but let me give you just 4 or 5 points. So Trump is clearly exploring a radically different relationship between the U.S. and China. And because it's so radically different, and also, first because most people don't take Trump seriously. I like Peter Thiel's line. Don't take him literally, but do take him seriously.
Great line.
Okay. So, if you listen to the pattern of activity and look at the body language and see the repeats and fill in the blanks, you can often see pointers in this, the Trump particular form of hyperbole. And clearly he's on a different track, a strikingly different track than Biden, or than Trump 1, or than Obama, or than on Bush, if we go back just to the 21st century. So, several points. First, Trump is not a reflexive China hawk. This is a piece I wrote back in the Washington Post in January or February, reminding people what he had done in the campaign. During the campaign, in a country in which 80% of the people have negative views about China, there was only one candidate running for the Congress or for Senate, or for the House or Senate or President, who had positive things to say about China, and it was Trump. And if you go back to his rallies or to his tweeting, he repeatedly says, I like China. I admire Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's brilliant. He says, my campaign people tell me I shouldn't say that, but I know this guy. He's brilliant. I think, he says, it's one of his most frequently used lines. I think the U.S. and China working together can solve any problem. So he started with a different perspective. It came from his reflecting on what he learned about Xi and China and the first term. Secondly, the foreign policy establishment, both Republican and Democrat, across the board, 90%, all see China first through a geostrategic lens as a competitor, great power competition, or geopolitically as a rival. And actually, in my book, Destined for War, I see China as the fiercest Thucydidean rival in all times. China is a rapidly rising power. The U.S. is a colossal ruling power. When the seesaw of power shifts as the light guy gets to be a heavy, you see a dynamic, a dangerous dynamic that most often ends in war. Last 500 years, 16 times we saw this movie. 12 times the outcome was war. So that's what most of the community would go with. Trump looks at this and says, well, let me take I would say your question, a very good question, a businessman's perspective on this, even a kind of corporate, diplomacy or corporate statecraft. So when he looks at China, he's looking at it differently. Third, Trump's version of businessman's diplomacy or statecraft distinguishes between the weak and the strong. The weak you bully and get your way in the short run. The strong you have to respect, especially if they're as strong as you are. So in his relationship with Xi and China, while he started out with 145% tariffs, imagining he could bully them in effect, once Xi stood up and reminded him that in the economic and supply chain realm, China has at least as many cards as we do, Trump immediately adjusted to the reality and began adjusting even more and more. So much so that the Ep3 now has this acronym for it. They call it TACO. Trump always chickens out. And the answer is that's not true. He didn't chicken out against Maduro or somebody weaker than he is. Only if somebody is strong or stronger. Mr. Market. When Mr. Market begins going wild with bond markets, President Trump realizes and adjusts. So in the case of China, he's imagining, I think, that he's facing a rival as strong as we are. And that maybe in business when you're doing that, you can find some way for the parties to do business, to actually do mutually beneficial business. And if you look at what he said after he met Xi in Korea back last month, and in the preparation for what will be his visit to China in April, he's been giving more and more signs that he's going to be searching for some version of a partnership rather than China as an adversary or enemy. Now, how that's going to work out, that's more complicated. But if we just remember here at the Kennedy School, so John F. Kennedy, quite interestingly, came into office, you'll remember, with the inauguration, saying the U.S. will pay any price, bear any burden to advance the cause of liberty around the world. He then lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, which he thought there was a 1 in 3 chance, better, that there were going to be nuclear weapons exploding on American soil and a couple 100 million people killed. And that was a searing experience for him. And he then gave his most important ever foreign policy speech, the American University commencement speech, which we have a quotation up on those pillars between here and the Charles Hotel, which you're walking back over there, in which he says, I've been thinking about this, and I don't think we can resolve our differences between us and the Soviet Union in the short run. I still believe we're the good guys and they're evil, but we have to now focus on, quote, making a world safe for diversity. And this is before diversity was a code word now. So for a world, we have to make the world safe enough for an evil empire, the Soviet Union, which he believed it was, and a good U.S.-led free world, which he believed it was. But we still have to survive, given our nuclear arsenals. So that's in the backdrop of Trump's reflection on this, since he's thought a lot about nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and understands in his view that his primary mission after making America great, or in making America great, is to avoid any great war.
Like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm,
Yes.
first avoid a
That's
war. Let me ask you a process question and then focus on Russia, if we may, for a minute, particularly Ukraine.
Let me go back to one other point.
Go ahead.
So you, again, and I are two of the only ones old enough to remember, but there was a time in the 1960s and 70s that there were radical movements in the U.S. Some were called hippies or whatever, and there they campaigned against nuclear war, and their slogan was "Make love, not war." So I'm waiting for somebody to create a banner for Trump, which would be called "Make money, not war," or "Make wealth, not war."
Well, it would be preferable. In addition to all the official apparatus of foreign affairs, the frontline team that Trump has dispatched to deal with Ukraine is a real estate mogul buddy and his son-in-law. That's very out of the ordinary. Is it a refreshing breath of air, or is it going to lead to diplomatic chaos?
I think the answer is yes to both. So, what do we know about Ukraine and Russia's war in Ukraine? That this has now gone on for more than 3 years, approaching 4 next February. That certainly more than 1 million casualties between the two, maybe 2. A country, Ukraine, which a quarter of its population is now not living in Ukraine. Its economy, a third of it has been crushed. coming into winter now. The electrical system and the heating system.
1 million
80%.
customers were reported without power this
The
week.
number of the hours in Kiev, they have blackouts more than they have electricity. So this is a society that's been, crushed physically, but whose spirit and whose resilience and determination has shocked the world. I mean, I think that the U.S. intelligence community and the British intelligence community and the Israeli intelligence community and everybody else would have imagined Putin would have succeeded fairly quickly, given that he's and his armies were that strong in Ukraine that week, but they didn't. So nonetheless, as they fought on, they've simply lost a little more every month. We track in a project here at Harvard, Russia Matters. We have a report card every week on Wednesdays that says what happened in the last week, what happened in the last month in terms of the war. And every month, Ukraine has lost another couple of hundred square miles, and then just every month. So now there's this remaining 2,500 square miles of Donbass, one of the provinces that Russia has not yet seized, but it will over the next year or so at the current pace, unless there's an agreement. So this situation is one where it's a horror, and President Trump's feeling that he expresses over and over, this is kind of madness for people to be killing each other over something, first, that shouldn't have happened in the first place, and second, and where you can pretty much tell what the outcome is going to be like. Eventually. So why should we have these people killed, the next slice of them killed for another year? Now, into that has been thrown the diplomatic establishment that's worked on it in the various ways. And we must look at the results and see they didn't succeed. So Trump has decided that some combination of the force of his personality and then some people who do real estate deals or business-like deals, if they do it from a business perspective, can find some options that you couldn't find otherwise. And I think actually, given the track record of the alternative, trying something different is a reasonable idea. And Witkoff clearly is an interesting and effective negotiator, as is Jerry. And they both shown themselves to be pretty imaginative about the possibilities. So that's level one. Level two, at least again studying this historically, all of these issues have 99 dimensions, and they all are extremely complicated. So the fact that you've got kind of the outline of a deal doesn't mean that you have a deal. I don't, again, know enough about New York real estate deals to whether you can do the deal in principle and then you leave it to the guys to fill in the 99 layers. But for sure, the contract, the reason why it's long and complicated is because lawyers think about the 9 different ways to do this. And so I think in this case...
Well, we've seen the announced peace in Gaza, in Thailand, Cambodia, in other places, come unglued.
That's right. And I think while, again, Gaza, if we went to today, so many fewer people are being killed in Gaza today than they were before Trump did his thing. So that's good. Is Gaza going to be, is there going to be Gaza Riviera? Of course not. That's kind of Trump hyperbole. But could we have a Gaza governed by a U.S. General with an international peacekeeping or peacemaking force that would disarm Hamas? Well, now we get down to the hard problem. Who wants to go fight, kill, die, to take the weapon away from somebody who will fight, kill, die to keep his weapon? That's hard work. And everybody likes to talk about it, and nobody wants to do it. There's a reason why we're not volunteering Americans to do this. The reason why the Israelis military was doing this, because they were at war with these people. And this was after October 7th. So they've been prepared to do it.
And they're their neighbor. They got no choice.
And these guys are there, and will be there when they leave. But if you ask Turks, who we've been asking, or Europeans, we'll train people. Okay, we'll maybe
Not our
send some
problem.
money. Well, or just the idea. I mean, it is a kind of remarkable thing. Why would one human being risk his life for somebody else? Well, most don't. Those that do are courageous and deserve our admiration. Now, one is for my own self-preservation. You're going to kill me, I'm in self-defense.
Yeah.
I might maybe say, how about for my family? I hope so. Okay. How about for my neighbor down the street? And you're getting, and then one of the wonders of having a professional army, and one of the reasons why we should all respect people who serve more, is that they are upsetting their lives in taking an oath to go to
Wherever.
somewhere that they might not think is appropriate, and they may not think, and risk their lives and take other lives for ultimately our freedoms. I would say, God bless them.
Let me ask two final questions. We could go on for hours. It has been 54 years since essence of a decision. What's your next book? What's the next big project?
Well, a good question. So, the book that, I've been primarily focused on China for the last, 15 years. I'm not a China scholar. I never read Mandarin. I was not really, I thought China was just too big, too complicated, too many people. But both Henry Kissinger, my old mentor, and Lee Kuan Yew kept telling me, this is the beginning of the, maybe 20 years, beginning of the 21st century. And Graham, you need to pay more attention to China. And I would give all my races, so it's too big, too complicated, I don't know the language, whatever. I agree. This is the defining challenge of our lifetime, and for as far ahead as anybody can see. So that's point one. Point two. I wrote then and published now a decade ago, 2017, just as Trump was coming to office, Destined for War, Can the U.S. and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? And what that book does is offer, I think, the best diagnosis of the problem, the challenge. That is, what's happening in relations between the U.S. and China is, on the one hand, a meteoric rising power. Never has a country risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. Never. That makes us breathtaking. And every day I get a report on 10 more things that I can't believe. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have in the U.S. a colossal ruling power. Not since Rome has a country been so powerful and so globally powerful as the U.S. So whatever happens anywhere in the world, the U.S. is somehow entangled. So in that context, as Thucydides taught us, when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens to displace a major ruling power, most frequently the outcome is war. And the path to war is not that either of the parties wants a war. That's not what it is. The path to war is that in this seesaw shifting, perceptions begin to become misperceptions. And psychologically, I begin to think, what the hell is going on here? I used to have my feet suddenly on the ground, and now they're lifting up, and it's you that's doing this. So who do you think you are? You actually grew up and succeeded in an environment that I created. But you're thinking, wait a minute, I wasn't even there when you made these rules, and these rules don't take account of my interests. This is what happened in Atlantis and Sparta, this happened in Germany and the UK. So that's pattern normally ends in a war. So that's book one. And now, if I were to write a book today, and I'm going through the pieces, I would say that gets at about half the picture, but not more. So half is, this is a genuine Thucydidean and rivalry, and the U.S. and China will be the fiercest rivals in all time. And the most likely outcome is a catastrophic war. And Henry thought that was more and more likely as he reached his 100th year. So the other half of the problem, you could maybe call it a mad world. That is, this rivalry is playing out in a world in which, one, U.S. and China each have robust nuclear arsenals. Arsenals that are so powerful that even if one attacks the other and attempts to disarm it, the attack can respond in a way that destroys the attacker. So that's called mutual assured destruction. So you attack me, you can kill me, but not without dying. Well, that has a stabilized, that at least clarifies the matter. You decide, no, I don't really think that's a good idea if it's going to destroy me. So that's what. Secondly, we live in an enclosed biosphere, and even though President Trump doesn't agree, every scientist agrees that on the current greenhouse gas emission tracks, either the U.S. and China by itself could make the whole biosphere uninhabitable for everybody. So I have to do something about that. Third, we have a financial system that is so entangled that when we had a great financial crisis here in the U.S. in 2008, that would have become a global depression, as Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of Treasury playing the hand, says, had it not been for a joint Chinese-American stimulus. As two economies work together to prevent that happening, and it would otherwise. Well, if we'd had a depression, we can remember what happened last time with the depression. It's terrible economically, but also in that environment grew up Nazism, communism, whatever. So, in addition, we have an economic system now that's so entangled that, as we learned when Trump was trying to bully China, and the Chinese came back with closing or squeezing the supply chain for rare earth magnets, that if they deny us rare earth magnets, our production lines for automobiles, for electronics, for F-35s, for Tomahawk missiles, for almost everything closes down. So, and similarly, they're dependent on us for advanced semiconductors and software and airplane engines and, well, soybeans they can buy from someone else. There's some for which we're the prime. So I would say, if you take all of those things together, we're inextricably entangled. So now, how can a party be both a fierce rival on the one hand and entangled in a partnership on the other? And the answer is, that sounds like a contradiction. It is. Okay? But
it's a contradiction we have to live.
Can you manage that? If that's the world you have to live in, that's the world you have to live in. So I'm exploring, and that's why I'm seeing Trump's exploration of this, a silver lining. What's a strategic concept that would embrace both fierce rivalry and intense cooperation? So sometimes in business this is called co-opetition. So I compete and I cooperate. Or there's a famous case in Chinese history of something that was called a rivalry partnership. So the Sun and the Liao were fierce rivals in some areas and intense partners in the other. And actually, if you look at the U.S. and Soviet Union in the Cold War, once we got to Kennedy's insight that we can't have a war, we learned to coexist, it was sometimes called. Or there was, in Kissinger-Nixon, détente. Or in Reagan, a nuclear war cannot be won, must therefore never be fought. Which doesn't mean we can still be rivals. Doesn't even mean that ultimately one of us might succeed relative to the other, just not by military conflict. So that's the space in which I'm looking at.
Well, you, in Foreign Affairs recently, quoted three numbers that I think would be a good place to end this discussion as we look at the new year. 80 years since the last World War, 80 years since the last nuclear bomb, and 9 nations only that have nuclear arsenals that we could confirm today. Are you cautiously optimistic at least that we'll make it 81?
Well, I would say 81 looks pretty good since we're halfway there. But I think you're good to remember the peace, and there's a very big idea there, which I think maybe if we're coming to year end, is for being to remind us to be thankful for it. So here are 3 numbers, and you've cited them, which if you can remember, and you can identify the question to which each one of these is the answer, you have the big picture about international security during the entire lifetime of virtually every American, certainly you and me. So first 80 is how long since the last great power war. This is the longest period of peace since Rome. Wow. So this is totally anomalous, totally ahistorical. We not a fact of nature. It's an accomplishment. What was built as the post-Cold War order, and then at the end of the Cold War, what's continued to be constructed thereafter. But I would say that order is unraveling. And many of the things we're currently doing are encouraging the unraveling. So I would say a year maybe, but 20, I would doubt. The second, how many years since nuclear weapons were used in war? In 1945 or 50, if you had offered bets about what's the likelihood no use of nuclear weapons in war for 50 years or 20 years, you'd have got 1,000 to 1 odds. So how did this ever happen? Again, amazing. Came very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But over time, people became to be more and more clear how if I ended up in a nuclear war, I may end up destroying my own society, and so that's plus a number of close calls. How likely that to be sustained? A year, yes, but generation, I don't think so. And then 9 is the most incredible one. So how in the world would 100 states have a capability to build a nuclear arsenal if they want to? North Korea has nuclear weapons, excuse me. So who couldn't? This is 80-year-old technology, not like rocket science or something. So watching Putin's war against Ukraine, how many states are thinking, wait a minute, if I had a nuclear arsenal, would he be invading me? I don't think so. So right now in many capitals, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Poland, Scandinavian countries, people are looking at Plan B, I think. So again, I think it's unlikely. I don't see anybody right on the verge of weapons, particularly since Iran was set back a little bit. But if you ask me, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, highly unlikely that there will be some
the party will grow.
So we've actually been beneficiaries, you and me and every other person, that we've been able to live our whole lives without something that if it were happening would define our whole lives.
Absolutely. Well, Graham, thank you very much. I remain even deeper in your debt as I have been all these years. And we'll announce plans for Across the Aisle in January in the next couple days.
Across the dusty roads, hear the organ play. Packed up my Chevy at the break of day, Headed east on two-lane highways. Stopped in a town where the courthouse stands. Shook every hand, felt the dreams and their plans. From small town porches to the steps of state lines. Voices rising up in proud design. Grassroots hearts can change the course we're on. One by one we'll carry on. In the Capitol halls, I joined the crowd. Spoke for the hopeful, spoke for the loud. Heard every story written in calloused hands. Found every neighbor in these scattered lands. From small town porches to the steps of state lines. Voices rising up in proud design. Grassroots hearts can change the course we're on. One by one we'll carry on. From small town porches to the steps of state lines. Voices rising up in proud design. Grassroots hearts can change the course we're on. One by one we'll carry on, we'll carry